Thank you all for coming today. I'm Amy Johnson. I'm the director of the Roanoke County Historical Society. So I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank our speaker, and I also want to thank our volunteers for checking you in and greeting you with a warm smile. I'm going to just go over a couple of things that are going to be happening here. So this is the 2025 U.S. Dakota War commemoration. I want to also thank our partner in this, the Junior Pioneers, our sponsor, the Junior Pioneers of New Ulm and vicinity, and then our special partnership this year with the New Ulm Public Library, and also being supported by the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. So we are also, tomorrow we will have a noon speaker again with Bryn Mars for the Dakota Indian encampment at Fort Snelling. That will be free. We do ask for people to sign up just for capacity reasons. We do have a sign-up sheet back there too. There will also be a walking tour tomorrow at 10:30 to 11:30. That's $7 per person. We'll just meet in front of the museum. No registration is required for that. And that's at the New Ulm downtown U.S. Dakota War sites. Saturday we will also have a 10:30. We moved it to the morning so that we were trying to keep it cooler in case it got warm in the afternoon. So 10:30 on Saturday as well. Meet again in front of the museum, $7 a person of the walking tour, New Ulm's U.S. Dakota War sites. And then from 11 to 3, the battery will be at the Kiesling House. So the Kiesling House will also be open Friday and Saturday from 11 to 3. $3 admission for that. And then on Sunday, we will end this with the cemetery tour. Again, this is free. It starts at 2 o'clock. And just meet out at the Pioneer section of the New Ulm City Cemetery at the maintenance building. So let's see. I also want to mention that John Haymond, who's our speaker today, he has books for sale in the museum store. I think we only got 7 copies, and he has signed those books. So if you're interested in purchasing a book, we have them over in the museum store. So I guess without any. Because I just want to thank Leroy Harris here, because the reason that John is here today is because Leroy reached out to me to say, like, let's bring up this man from Texas to talk about his book, The Infamous Dakota War Trials of 1862. So I'm going to have Leroy come up here and just talk to you a little bit about our speaker today, and then also our partnership with the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. It's afternoon, so I can say good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to see you all out here today. As Amy mentioned, I'm Leroy Harris. I'm the Programming and Technology Services Librarian over at the New Ulm Public Library. It's a mouthful. But one of the wonderful parts of my job is that I get to try to coordinate, plan, and facilitate programs for adults in our wonderful community that we have here. One of the ways that I do that is, as I think about things that people have talked about or shown interest in, is I try to find people who are experts in that topic or have a lot of experience with that topic, and I just reach out and say, would you be interested in coming to our community? The worst they can do is ignore me, which happens. Sometimes they can say no, but as I'm pleasantly surprised to find many times is the case, as they say they would love to. And that's kind of what happened here. Is I reached out to John after learning more about his book and knowing that the Dakota War commemoration was coming up. I asked if he'd like to come speak, and he said he'd love to, which is always thrilling to me. But making it possible for a speaker to come here is different from them being willing to come here. And so I very much want to thank the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund for making programs like this possible. Without that funding, a lot of the wonderful speakers, presentations, and performers that would not be possible to have in a community of our size. And so after the presentation, before you leave, on the back table there is a small half-sheet survey that I'd love for you to fill out as part of the grant reporting process, which helps to ensure that funding like this can continue. So it's just a few simple questions. You don't even have to put your name on it. So if you could fill that out after the presentation, that would be great. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor John Haymond, and he's written several historical books, one of which is specifically he'll be talking about today. But he's an expert in military law and served for 21 years in the Army. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John and let him take it away. John.
Thank you. So I'm going to have to play around with the mic and figure out what the right volume is. I did my master's degree in Scotland, and the first time I ever presented an academic paper was at a conference down in London at the National Army Museum. And as luck would have it, I was the first speaker. And I think it was because I was also the least known and the most unimpressive speaker. So, but as we're all standing waiting to get into the auditorium that morning, I happened to be right behind the museum director, and I didn't know it was him, and he didn't know me. And all of a sudden, one of his staff comes running up to him and says, "We have a problem, we have a problem. The PA system is not working." And the director looks at his agenda and says, "Oh, we have time. Our first speaker's an American. He probably won't need a microphone." So, I am very happy to be back in Minnesota. I'm originally from Florida. I grew up in Southeast Asia. I went into the military when I was 21. I've lived all over the world. Minnesota is my adopted state, or it adopted me. I'm not sure which. But when I did a deal with the devil to get me stationed in Duluth, Minnesota, the Army thought I was confusing it with Duluth, Georgia. They said, "You never saw snow until you joined the military." I was like, "I know." So once upon a time, I was the director of the Mower County Historical Society over in Austin, which is far less impressive than your incredibly historic building here. And the thing that, Austin can really be proud of is spam. And so at one point, did somebody have any idea of how many hogs does Hormel slaughter in Austin every day? 19,000 on average. So one year, the Chamber of Commerce was trying to come up with a new branding slogan for Austin, and I suggested the place where pigs go to die, but nobody thought that was okay, so this is going to be a study of one particular aspect of the Dakota War, which will be the military commission trials that followed the war. And then we're going to talk about some of the controversies that came out of it. Now, normally, I would spend about 10, maybe 15 minutes giving an overview of the war itself, because quite often I'm talking to audiences that are not as familiar with it. I suspect that here, you guys are better informed right off the bat, and you at least understand the background of the events, right? Okay, so then we will skip over that pretty quickly. Now, as Leroy said, I have written several books. This was my first. How do you write a book? Does anybody know? If you're me, you don't know you're doing it while you're doing it. This actually started as, I had a directed research project when I was at the University of Minnesota Duluth that I had to finish. And so I started researching this, and it was really interesting. And then the more I got into it, didn't do this to you.
No, didn't.
Didn't recognize his greatness. Well, can you hear me if I talk without it?
Yes.
Okay.
It's American.
Oh, no. It's because I'm half blind at short distance, so I can read. So, this was started just as a college paper. And I picked at the subject for the two stupidest reasons anybody could ever pick a topic. Number one, the archive was really close in St. Paul at the State Historical Society, so it's convenient. Number two, I thought, oh yeah, I already know a lot about it. Turns out, I did not. And then, my very first day in the archive, I had that experience that every historian dreams and hopes of, which is I found a document that no one else had seen that completely changed the topic. 2 weeks later, I discovered that no, I was not the guy who discovered it. It was known. It had been referenced by a couple of other authors at different points. That's when I learned the second most important lesson, which is sometimes it's not that you find something no one else knows about. It's that you see something that you understand in a way that no one else has yet. Because the military commission trials that followed this war were military commission trials, not civilian law. And more to the point, 19th century military law. So almost every commentary that was written between 1862 and 2017 tried to interpret it, judge it, analyze it through the lens of civilian law. Doesn't work. You'll be wrong every time if you try. Now, that title there was my title. Does anybody have a copy of the book in hand right now at the moment? Would you read the main title?
The Infamous Dakota War Trials of 1862.
Nowhere on here does it say the infamous. The publisher stuck that word in there, and because it was my first book, I didn't know that I could have fought tooth and nail to get that. I feel like the word infamous sounds too much like you're trying to sensationalize a topic that does not need to be sensationalized. That's my opinion. So, if I was writing the same book again today, I would fight for it. By the way, does anybody know what this kind of title is called? When you have title, you have the colon, and then you have subtitle? It's a German title. That's what we actually call it in academia. Because, you know, in German, and how many of you speak German? Some German? You sprechen ein bisschen gute Akzentstärke? And so, you take big words, cram them all together, make an Überwort. Right? So, that was the book. Like I said, it was my first book. It got published in 2016. When the reviews came out, that was the first review I ever got, was this one up here by Library Book Watch. I distinctly remember reading that and going, oh, they got the wrong book. I don't think that's mine. So, turns out the book was extremely well received. One of my professors at UMD, when I was just starting on this, I gave him the first 100 pages of the book to look over. And he read it, and he gave it back to me, and he said, if this ever gets published, it's going to piss a lot of people off. And I said, oh, that's bad. He said, no, that's good. That means people are going to be paying attention to it. And in the 9 years since the book came out, it has kind of, it's now kind of acknowledged as the authoritative question on the legal controversies following the war. And also, as a challenge to some of the established scholarship and some of the stories that were, kind of canonized as a part of time going by are not always reliable. So we'll get into some of that. So, 2 quotes. The one I really want you to pay attention to is the bottom one, because one of the things that you very quickly get when you start reading the primary sources is that the Dakota are always kind of pictured as wanton savages, and that their methods of waging war were just absolutely unparalleledly brutal, and therefore deserving of the severest reprisals. But Samuel Pond, and I hope you guys know, you recognize the name, right? Samuel Pond's book on the Dakota as they were is absolutely essential reading. If you want, and yes, it's seen through the lens of a European American. And there are some of his, we all bring our own biases to every discussion that we engage in. Pond tried to be as open-minded, as understanding of the Dakota as he could be. And it comes through in his work. And that, I believe, is where we need to start when we look at how the war was fought, how the war was reacted to by the American government afterwards. So, Sibley's going to come in for numerous commentary as we go through this. This is an almost prescient statement that he makes 12 years before the war breaks out. He could see it coming. And yet, at the same time, having studied Sibley closely, I believe he was honestly shocked by the intensity of the war and the savagery with which it was fought. And savagery, by the way, is a term we can apply to combat operations, whether they're conducted by Europeans, Americans, Africans, Native Americans, doesn't matter who. War is brutal, okay? So, we all know where this is, yes? So when the war breaks out in August, there are several things that very quickly set this conflict apart in American history, although the American frontier. And it is that, first of all, it's the bloodiest Indian war since the colonial period. It's also the first time since the colonial period when Native Americans made concerted, repeated attacks on defended forts and or established cities, towns, settlements. Okay. More white people are killed in this conflict than in any other of the Indian wars during the frontier period of the 19th century. It also results then in a completely different reaction after the war is over. So, 3 days after the friendly aspect of the Dakota gave up the captives who had been surrendered to them by the war faction of the Dakota, Sibley at Camp Release convenes the military commission courts with this, General Order number 55. And by the way, anybody know what paleography is? Paleography is the study of archaic or ancient handwriting. Sibley has actually pretty legible handwriting, but when I was researching this, I would find some letters, handwritten letters in the state archives, that were a drunken chimpanzee with a crayon in his fist would have written better than that. I would copy these things out and walk around for weeks harassing everybody who would stand still of, what do you think that scribble is? And there were some of the best I could get was maybe 80 or 75% certainty of where we were at. Sibley, on the other hand, when Sibley writes something, you can read it. So there's two phases of the trial, which we're going to talk about. This is the only photograph known to exist of one of the trial venues, and this is the converted storeroom at the lower agency, where the second series of trials is carried on. 303 Dakota are sentenced to death. 38 are executed at Mankato on that one single gallows the day after Christmas in 1862. That number is winnowed down by President Lincoln's review, which he directs to search for men who can be shown to be complicit in acts of massacre or rape, those two crimes in particular, and that results in a death list of 40 that then, through a couple of different steps, is reduced to 38. 38 men go to the news. So, now we get into the meat of it. These two men are at the heart of the entire controversy that you have to engage with if you're going to talk about the military commission trials. By the way, how many of you are interested in Civil War history? Okay, so we're all familiar with John Pope, right? One of my favorite historians of the American West is a historian named Robert Utley. Utley once wrote of Pope that he was a man who would never use one word when 10 would do. Lincoln said of Pope, "Oh yes, I know the popes, liars to a man." So the military commission trials. This is going to look like you're in school for a second. Just bear with me. We'll get back to the pictures real quick. You need data first, okay? So Sibley convenes the first iteration of the military commission trial on 28 September 1862. The composition of the court, as it stands right there. It's in session from the 20th of September to the 3rd of November. There are 392 cases, 391 defendants, and I'm used to teaching, so this is going to be interactive. I expect you to answer when I ask questions. So how can you have 392 cases but only 391 He's found innocent the first time, and he's retried. His last name is Crawford. He's one of the mixed race Dakota. So he is tried twice, and he's acquitted in both cases. There are 303 death sentences, 20 prison sentences, 69 acquittals, of whom 61 of them continue to be held in close confinement, which in itself is a departure from American judicial process. Now, here's the question. Was there any reason to hold trials at all? What do you think? Yes? No? If you say no, raise your hand. Raise your hand, come on. Okay, I forget. I'm back in Minnesota, which reminds me that I am uncomfortable being this close to Iowa, but I'll get over it. Do you know the difference between an introvert and an extrovert in Minnesota? An introvert looks at his shoes while he's talking to you. An extrovert looks at your shoes while he's talking to you. So, I'm feeling like about half of you think no reason to hold trials, and therefore the other half of you would say yes, there should have been trials, or you're just abstaining like a non-functioning member of Congress who won't do the damn job. Okay. How you answer that question, I would suggest, depends entirely on how you answer this question. And by the way, I want to apologize. These slides were made to be shown on a smartboard, the whiteboard. Okay. There's something about the pixelation in the TV screens where not only does it absorb my laser pointer, but it also fuzzies things up a little bit. So these are not going to look as high def as they actually are. It's not me. Okay, so at least 600 people die in the war. Are they casualties of war, or are they victims of crime? Okay, both, meaning each person is both, or there are some of one and some of the other? I would agree with you. I absolutely would. I think you're absolutely correct.
So what did she say?
That some are crimes, some are casualties of war.
Well, you talked about in war. Most of the casualties were actually before the war started.
How do you define war? And I asked this question for one reason. I gave this talk once in Northfield, and I had a man almost come to blows with me, like call me out, because he said there never was any such thing as a Dakota War. It's never happened. I told him to come to New Ulm and say that out loud. So that's
I'm saying the war started when they attacked soldiers.
That's an interesting distinction. That's an distinction. We'll get back to that. It's a valid point. I can see it both ways. Yeah. Okay, so
the attack on the soldiers came on the 18th, first day. Yeah, Marsh's crew, Fort Ridge.
are you talking about when Captain Marsh is ambushed at the river crossing?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So if we start the war with the attack on the Homestead, Acton Township, then those young men come back to the encampment, to the Dakota camp, and they say, this is what we did, and now there's a council, do we go to war, do we not? And then the next day, we have the attack on the lower agency, and then we have the Army response from Fort Ridgely, and then Captain Marsh and about 13 of his men are killed at the river crossing. And then it's
Well,
a
that
gunfight.
wasn't an Army response.
I'm sorry?
That wasn't an Army response, though, to murdering civilians.
That was an Army response to the war that the Indians had risen, meaning risen in arms.
Okay.
They had no idea what was going on. When Captain Marsh did not approach that crossing of the river as if he was expecting a fight. He was not in a combat formation. Clearly, he thought something had happened. I'm inclined to think that he probably was under the impression that based on all of the conflict that had been going on over the traders releasing the stores before the gold payment arrived from Washington, he may have thought that the Indians were attacking the storehouses to get food. Not that they were killing everybody that they could see.
At the ferry,
Yep.
they were told by the Dakota that they were being attacked by the Chip,
By
by the Chippewa Ojib now.
Right, and one of the men who's hanged in Mankato, White Dog, is accused of lulling Captain Marsh et al. Into a false sense of security, which I actually talk about in the book because I disagree with that conclusion. I disagree with the legal conclusion that he committed a violation of the laws of war by doing so. Okay, so there is such a thing in war. It's an absolutely reprehensible phrase, but unfortunately it applies, and that is collateral damage. To call a human being collateral damage is a hard thing to do. But collateral damage is when somebody is killed incidentally in connection with military operations, not because they are targeted by military operations. There's no collateral damage in this conflict. People are killed deliberately because they're targeted deliberately. Whether they are Dakota or whether they are white settlers, they're targeted deliberately. Okay? The impressions or the way in which the conflict is portrayed right away casts the Dakota in the role much the same way that we in the United States characterized the Japanese on December 8, 1941. That there's some kind of dastardly plot. They had been scheming to stab us in the back all along. This was not an act of war. This was an act of treachery, that they attacked us while they were still carrying on with negotiations, etc., etc. Well, the argument that was used immediately after, and while the war was still going on here in Minnesota, was that there had to be some kind of outside agitation to this. Because think about it in the broader context. Think outside of Minnesota for a second. In 1862, what else is going on in the country? And not just the Civil War, it's the worst freaking year of the Civil War for the North. There have been 3 major defeats, one after the other. There's going to be another one before the end of the year, Fredericksburg, right? Antietam, Second Manassas. This is how John Pope winds up getting his chubby butt shipped out to Minnesota, is because he gets his clock clean at Second Manassas, and they shove him off to the west. But there's all this agitation going on that, hey, clearly it's to the Confederacy's advantage to cause an uprising in one of the western states that the North will then have to respond to. Because, anybody make out what that whiskey jug says? Agent CSA. CSA is? Confederate States of America. Exactly. Exactly. It's a conspiracy theory. No such connection was ever proven. No evidence has ever been found to support it. But it was definitely making the rumor mill rounds for a while. So, where everybody winds up affected by the war covers almost all of southwestern Minnesota. And Brown County is one of the 2 counties hardest hit. Brown County and Renville County are the 2 that get the most loss of life. The heaviest fighting occurs here and in Renville County. So, as soon as Sibley creates the military commission trials, they come in for criticism from people like Bishop Whipple, whom I actually am, I'm inclined to think he's on the right side of many questions. I don't always agree with Whipple's conclusions, but I absolutely believe in his sincerity. Now, other comments or criticisms of the military commission trials come later on as we come forward in history. And for the record, has anybody read any of Dr. Anderson's work?
Sure.
Okay. I would say he's absolutely essential reading. He really is. He's built most of his academic reputation on this. He's what I have, the closest thing I have to a nemesis. an academic rival, you know, pistols at dawn kind of thing. But when he limits himself to certain stuff, he's spot on. I disagree with his conclusions, as we'll see. Now, this is why I was talking about the distinction between military law and civilian law. If you want to understand, and if you want to poke holes in Sibley's handling of the military commission trials, if you want to argue there should never have been trials at all, or that they were illegitimate, you got to read that. If you don't read that first, you don't understand what any of it should be or do.
So I noticed when you mentioned earlier about crime victim, no character, because I've read a lot about the Nuremberg laws and the blue cases and the green cases, that was such a thing at the time to establish crimes against humanity and war crimes. In the 19th century, were they called the UCMJ back then?
No. UCMJ doesn't come into existence until the late 1950s. And
There's no characterization of
There's
war
no
crimes or
characterization.
excesses during war, is
here's
there?
the thing, the first international conventions on laws of war have not yet been codified at this point in history. There are concepts, which we're going to talk about, but there's no such thing to say that you can kill this person, you can't kill that person, prisoners of war have to be treated this way, and by the way, what is a prisoner of war? That hasn't been established yet at this point in time. So,
Ambiguous.
at the very least, it puts us at the risk of attempting to interpret the past through a standard that's established today that we understand and are familiar with, but that never existed to them then. So what we have to do is we have to examine those events then by the law and the culture as it existed then. Otherwise, we get into revisionist history. And I give that the extended middle finger. Okay? Revision is appropriate in history when you have evidence that has not yet been entered into the record, something that's just been discovered, or you have the opportunity to add voices to the discussion that were left out of the original collection of information. You should always be willing to revise the history when you learn more about it, but you should never revise the history just to make it fit what makes you happy today. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Would it go further since the Sioux Confederacy was not a citizen or a portion or a part of the United States, just as Japan was not part of the United States?
That's actually one of the things that is a central point to this. We'll get to that.
Sorry.
No. That's you're already thinking in the right context. Okay, so let's ask the question directly. Was the military commission a legally convened court? Did it have any authority, any jurisdiction? Well, first of all, does anybody know what does American law say about when a military court can function? Anybody know? First of all, a military court can never function if civilian courts are still able to function. You cannot just simply create martial law on top of it, right? But in time of war, or in a theater of war, then military law can be applied even to civilians. But that's a tricky minefield that you got to tiptoe through. And so it's not an automatic. So, Catherine Darunian Sadola, she's a professor of literature, right? She's not a historian. I disagree with every conclusion she makes when she ventures into history. But if you've never read her book, it is absolutely critical to read it. She has done amazing work in examining every single personal narrative and oral history that came out of the war. She does a better job of comparing what people said in 1862 and what the same person said in 1870, what the same person said in 1885. You see how their stories change sometimes along the way. In that, as a professor of literature, she's incredible. I disagree with her historical conclusions. Just so you know. Okay? So the argument is that the military commission was not a legally convened court because Sibley never had the authority required by the Articles of War. Well, what do the Articles of War say? The other one is that the military commission was not a legal court because the Articles of War, again, would have prevented Sibley from convening such a court for reasons of prejudice, which we'll talk about. So here's the lack of authority argument. I'll let you read that for yourself.
Read it for me, I got a
Oh,
reflection.
okay. Sibley lacked the authority to establish a military court-martial or commission, but it is clear that General John Pope, his superior, did have such authority and would have approved Sibley's action. Thus, the objection to Sibley's authority is largely a technical one. And that's by a professor named Douglas Linden. Next one. The military commission had no legal jurisdiction, and Sibley had no authority to create it. That's by Rhoda Gilman, who I worked with pretty closely when I was researching this. She was incredibly helpful. But here again, when she's offering an opinion on military law, that's where I take an issue. Here's what the Articles of War say. The 65th article says, any general officer commanding an army or a colonel commanding a separate department may appoint general courts-martial whenever necessary. Okay? Now, first of all, this argument is absolutely never going to hold water. If you have the authority, it's your authority. If I'm your boss, you can't do something just because you think I would approve of it. You either have the authority on your own or you have none. So just because Pope would have agreed with it, as far as the military is concerned, that counts for nothing, right? So let's get a start. Now, what about this one though? What was Sibley's rank at this point in time? See,
Colonel wasn't.
he's a colonel. So he's not a general officer commanding an army. Is he a colonel commanding a separate department? No. The department is the Department of Wisconsin, which covers Minnesota. That's commanded by John Pope. Sibley is commanding an expeditionary force in the field, a much smaller characterization. So, based on that, does Sibley have any authority? Remember? General Order number 55, this is what convenes the authority. This is Sibley's signature at the bottom of it. H.H. Sibley, Colonel commanding military expedition. According to this document, Sibley does not have the authority to convene the military court-martial. And yet I say that it's going to legally convene court-martial. Why? Because this is 28 September. On 29 September, a telegram reaches General Pope from the War Department back in Washington, which says, based on his judicious conduct at the Battle of, I think they called it Yellow, it was the Battle of Wood Lake, but they called it something else.
Yellow.
Thank you. That as a result of that, Sibley is promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. Now what that really means is that every single case that was heard on the 20th of September should have been thrown out on review, because at that point it was not a legally constituted court. But every single day the commission met after that, under Sibley's signature, it was a legally convened court at that point. Does that make sense? Okay. This is why you have to pay attention to the small details. Now, the command prejudice argument. Sibley did not have a right to form a commission because of the issue of prejudice. The Articles of War, Article 65, basically says that a commander in the field cannot form a body of officers for a court-martial because of the fear of prejudice. This is when Dr. Anderson was trying to shoot holes in an article that I had submitted for publication years ago. The article says, whenever a general officer shall be the accuser or the prosecutor of any officer in the Army of the United States under his command, the general court-martial for the trial of such officer shall be appointed by the President of the United States. Can anybody tell me where Dr. Anderson missed completely? Well, first of all, who is Sibley putting on trial? The Dakota are not officers of the U.S. Army. They are certainly not under Sibley's command as soldiers. That's a non sequitur. That has absolutely no bearing on the question. Are we agreed on that? You're allowed to tell me I'm wrong about it. Because I know you'll do it like Minnesotans. You'll say it politely, or you will throw a corn cob at me, because God knows we are surrounded by so much corn. I forgot how much corn there is around here. This morning, I had also forgotten what color Minnesota State Police cars are. And I was coming over a hill. I wasn't above 90, but I could see 90 on the speedometer. And that state trooper had just hit his lights about a quarter mile in front of me to pull over some other Porsche Monk. So I went by at a very sedate 65 miles an hour. Okay. So, were the Dakota defendants denied the due process of law? This is a central question that gets, this one really gets people upset. So, here are the allegations, and I will tell you whether they're correct or not. The Dakota defendants were not represented by defense counsel. That is true. The capital nature of the trials were not explained to them. That is also true. The trials were conducted so fast as to make a travesty of the entire process. That is both true and false. The defendants were convicted for participation in battle rather than specific acts of murder, massacre, or rape. And that is also true and false, depending on which individual case we look at, okay? So, what about that criticism that the defendants were not represented by defense counsel? That's absolutely true. There was not an attorney anywhere in the room. There was not an attorney even in, But here's the thing. When people like this is another author from 2014, Lincoln could not ignore the fundamental unfairness in the hastily convened trials without the benefit of counsel. The Sixth Amendment mandates that an accused is entitled to a speedy trial with the assistance of counsel. Does that apply to soldiers of the U.S. Army? Does it? No. Did you know? How many of you are military veterans? Does this sound familiar? I state your name, do solemnly swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to obey the orders of the President, etc., etc. Okay. A lot of people who've never stood and raised your right hand are shocked to realize that in order to take the oath of enlistment, you must give up some of the civil rights that you have just sworn to defend. Do you have freedom of speech in the military?
No.
Is criticizing the president, the vice president, the secretary of the army, secretary of the state, is that acceptable? No, that's a court-martial offense. Did you know that dueling is still an offense under American military law? It looks like this. He and I have a disagreement. He says, you want to take it outside? And I say, yeah, let's go. That's challenge given, challenge received, now we are dueling and we're both in trouble. So military law can be pretty, it's a snake sometimes, all right? But here's the thing, is that in the 19th century, under the Articles of War, there is no requirement for an attorney to be present in any court-martial. And out of the thousands of American soldiers who were faced a court-martial during the American Civil War, less than 2% of them were represented by an attorney, and every one of those trials was legal, because that was the law at the time. So this is not disqualified. It's unfair, and it offends our notions of what justice and due process should look like, but it was not illegal then. The same standard applied to American soldiers just as it applied to Dakota. Now here's the thing where it gets really problematic. The judge advocate. I read some books, more than one, articles talking about this case where the judge advocate, first of all, is not a judge. Okay, just to be real clear about that. The judge advocate is the prosecutor for the government's case, who in this case, as in all cases, is supposed to prosecute the defendant, find him guilty, while at the same time making sure that his rights are protected and that every objection that can be raised on his behalf is done so. It's a man playing chess with himself. The contradictions in there should be immediately apparent to everybody. It was an unwieldy system. It didn't work then. It didn't work right up until the time it was abolished.
When you talked about earlier with the people on the commission, I looked at the names of one of those was Grant,
Yes.
who was with Joseph Brown leading that expedition. They almost all got wiped out at Birch Coulee.
Yes.
So So he's supposed to be without prejudice, having been almost.
There's not a snowball's chance in hell that any of those men, and this was raised by Bishop Whipple, among others, that it is impossible for men to sit in judgment without bias over men who tried to kill them just a few days earlier. Human nature doesn't allow for that, right? It kind of goes back to what Winston Churchill said a prisoner of war is. Prisoner of war is a man who tries his best to kill you, and then when he fails, asks you not to kill him. Sibley. We have to come to Sibley because he's at the heart of it all. So the document that I said that I found that got me really excited, thinking that something that nobody else has seen, is this handwritten letter from Sibley to Bishop Whipple. And this is December 7th. This is while the verdicts of those 303 death sentences are being reviewed in Washington by Lincoln's attorneys. Okay? What caught my eye was the sentence that starts on the bottom of the first page and continues on the second page. And I've written it out for you so you can see it. Does anybody want to try to read Henry's? Here's what it says. I approve the proceedings because I had no reason to doubt the criminality of every man that had been condemned. On the contrary, I sent back many cases where men had been acquitted for lack of evidence for revision. And in several of these, additional testimony was adduced and the Indian sentence to be hung. In that single statement, Sibley is admitting to committing a violation of American military law that at the very least should have had him relieved from command, at the worst should have become a corporal himself. What is he saying? If you put this in civilian law terms, what is he saying? Double jeopardy. Men had been acquitted, which means found innocent. And he says, no. Take another look at it. And he sends them right back. Now remember, every member of that court that he appointed are under his direct command. This is called unlawful command interference. Now, it's one thing to find a letter where Sibley says he did it. That's not proof. What would proof be? How do you prove that he did it? Yes, the trial transcripts. So that means going back through every one of the trial transcripts to see if you can find any one of these several where a man was acquitted and then sentenced to death after.
I believe the court recorder, Isaac Hurd, was a lawyer.
He was, but he was not functioning as an attorney.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that really surprises me, because Hurd actually was an attorney of experience.
Yeah.
If he had been the trial judge advocate, he would at least have been expected to know the process. Now here's the other problem. How many of these men are graduates of the military academy? None. How many of them have experience with military law? None.
Including Hurd. He was
Exactly, he was a civilian lawyer. Exactly. So, case number 42, Dakota. He is found guilty of the charge as to specification, guilty as to specification, and then he's sentenced to imprisonment for, it continues on the page, for 5 years. He's already been found guilty, but he's only been sentenced to prison, not death. At some point after that, the imprisonment is crossed out, and underneath it is written, "Be hung by the neck until he is dead." Okay, so that is hard proof that a record of the court was altered after its original sentence, or finding. Now, to remove any doubt as to whether or not Sibley knew that this had happened, this is the cover of that trial transcript. And all of this is written in pen. This bit down here that looks faded, this is pencil. And what it says is that he had been sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. And then that line is crossed out. And the pencil notation down at the bottom says, "Be hung sentence changed to death. And just to make sure you know who's writing this, return for further consideration of the Military Commission, H.H. Sibley, Brigadier General Commanding. That's his signature. So, that should remove any question as to whether or not what Sibley said he did actually did happen, right? Now, case number 301, Echaduza. This one's even more egregious. Echaduza is found not guilty of the specification, not guilty of the charge, and then again, at some point after that, the knots are crossed out. And in very, very fine handwriting underneath here to make it fit on top of Colonel Crooks. Colonel Crooks is the president of the commission. Make it fit on top of his signature is written the words, and sentence him to be hung by the neck until he is dead. So that's a man who was actually found completely innocent and acquitted, who's been returned to the commission and now has been sentenced to death. So, the military chain of command is what we have to look at to understand why this happened. Pope, that delightfully bombastic individual, is at the top of it all. And by the way, are any of you familiar with kind of the just outrageously dangerous statements that Pope was making when he comes out to Minnesota at this time? He's talking about exterminate all of Dakota, if they offer the slightest resistance, wipe them all out, blah, blah, blah. To give him his due, 15 years after this, John Pope is going to become one of the most impassioned advocates for Native American rights. I don't know what changed in him, but something happens between 1862 and the 1870s. And he's a different man and he's saying different things. It would make a fascinating study if anybody's interested in a deep dive.
Well, he's seen all the Indian wars that went on further west. That's probably what changed his mind.
It would have had a lot to do with it, I think, yeah. Okay, so Pope is in command of the department. Sibley is in command of the expeditionary force, and the members of the military commission are all officers serving directly under that chain of command. So everybody has, for the longest time, looked at Sibley as being the architect, the author, and the agent of all the injustice that happens in the military commission trials. Nobody looked at Pope for almost 100 years. And it wasn't until a friend of mine who published a really excellent book, Black Dakota, Walt Bachman. Great book. And Walt is a retired prosecutor from the Twin Cities, so he knows law. He's a phenomenal researcher. He found a letter that nobody knew existed. And in that letter, Pope is writing to Sibley. This is after the military commission trials have started. And Pope says, the slightest effort made by any officer to interfere with the well-merited death of these Indians will be considered treason to the government and treated accordingly. I cannot understand how you can consider any of the Indians whom you found in possession of captives to be friendly Indians, exterminate them all if they furnish the least occasion for it. He's saying to Sibley, what the hell are you doing? Why are you being such a soft namby-pamby? Why are you acquitting people? More convictions, more death sentences, and faster. Now, that is, again, unlawful command and influence. If you want to get an idea of how much this comes into play, that's the first phase of the trial over here, when it's just Sibley running things. This is what happens after Pope's letter to Sibley. Is there any doubt that something has changed? When we talk about some trials only lasting 5 minutes, all of that happens here. None of those happen here, okay?
Is there a legal term for that?
A legal term for,
Murder by, and when they do that, where they get almost like a, I don't know, it's not conspiracy, but how he did that. Is there a name for that? I forget what it is.
there's a phrase for it.
What is it?
Manipulation of verdict. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Did case 42 and 301 happen in phase 1 or 2?
2.
Thank you.
All right, so one of the really important things is not to get buried into discussions of arcane legal factors. Let's not forget the fact that in every war, people are involved, right? And there are victims on both sides of the equation, which is why it's not just the settler side, it's not just the Dakota side. There are people involved on all sides of it. So let's talk about some of the most controversial aspects of this case that really, I think, are done to death without sufficient understanding of the case. Concentration camps, ethnic cleansing, a death march, and the glorious 38. Was this a concentration camp? Tell me what you think. Yes or no?
No.
Yes. But only if we first establish that as soon as you say concentration camp in this country, people automatically think of Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Birkenau, Ravensbrück, right? The Nazis, the Second World War. Did the Nazis invent concentration camps? No. The British used them during the Boer War in South Africa, and the Americans used them at exactly the same time in the Philippines. But not to kill people, although in every instance where there's ever been a concentration of people into one space, inevitably disease and deprivation result, and people do die from it. The earliest uses of concentration camps at the end of the 19th century were to take a civilian population that was basically the commissariat for an irregular guerrilla army that you're fighting against, and put all civilians in one place where you can keep an eye on them and deprive your enemy of their support, right? In that sense, this is a concentration camp. But I will never accept somebody saying it's a concentration camp unless you qualify what you mean by that. Because to say that this, as one Dakota respondent did when the State Historical Society was collecting oral histories coming up to the sesquicentennial back in 2017, when he said, 2012, when he said that this was kind of like the Nazis' oven house, Auschwitz. No! No. Not on any level of comparable data could you make such an assumption. And by the way, are we familiar with the phrases ad infinitum, ad nauseum, ad Nazism? You know what that one means? It means as soon as you bring in the Nazis into any discussion, you have this right there, you have killed any possibility for intelligent discourse. So, no, it's not working. So some commentators have said things like, the Dakota remained imprisoned there in a disease-ridden enclosure throughout the winter, subsisting on rations of crackers, flour, and salt pork. Sounds really bad, right? Except, let's consider this. Those rations were government-issued military rations, the same thing that American federal troops subsisted on, not for 4 months, but for the 4 years of the American Civil War. The disease-ridden enclosure, the same diseases of typhoid and cholera that swept through the camp also swept through St. Paul that winter because you had so many refugees from the frontier, the southwestern counties that had crowded into the city and just overwhelmed sanitation and food supplies. The mortality rate was almost exactly the same. Now here's the problem, and this is where you have to be an honest adjudicator. Let's not forget that these people are not there by choice. These people are being held there in a very dangerous situation, not knowing what's going to happen next, fearful of the fact that there are plenty of people in Minnesota who now want them dead. Their situation is worse than what is going on in St. Paul, okay? Don't forget that. For some reason, it's not advancing. All right, I'll do my hand if I have to. Okay. It's not advancing at all. I have no idea. Oh, that'd be really ugly if it's one of those we have to reboot situations. Yeah. So the computer's working, but the TV is not. Oh, I've done that before. It does not work well. Yes?
some of those trials.
Mhm.
Has anybody looked at the change in the handwriting
Oh, yeah,
to figure out who wrote
yeah.
the changes?
Sibley is instantly easy to recognize. Once you start reading Sibley's handwritten stuff, well, of course, everything's handwritten back then. I went as far back as Sibley's early days in Minnesota as a fur trader, okay? So I can pretty much recognize his handwriting at 50 paces. Other handwritings a little bit more. From what I've seen on there and the other documents that kind of correspond with these, most of those changes look like they were done by Hurd, the court's recorder. He had crappy handwriting. And it's kind of like this heavy scrawl with a broad nib pen. So my first vote for who is probably doing it is Hurd as the court recorder. This is an excellent opportunity. If you have any questions, we can talk about while they're figuring that out.
How many of the acquittals ended up getting changed? You maybe said that earlier. How many were changed?
I'm not exactly sure. As near as I can figure, it's about half a dozen. Now, here's the other thing that's really important to understand too, okay? It's easy to get distracted by, the big, shiny object and lose some of the details inside. How many men went to the gallows and were hanged in Mankato because of those alterations? None. None. Lincoln did not approve a single one of those altered verdicts. But we need to be honest and say that Sibley certainly tried. Right? It was not for a lack of effort. Okay, now here's the question. Did the U.S. Army, the U.S. government, or the state of Minnesota pursue a program of ethnic cleansing after the war? Well, if you take very public statements by people like John Pope, Senator Wilkinson, Governor Ramsey, or that pioneering feminist editor Jane Grey Swisshelm, yes, absolutely. They certainly did. But what about genocide? Did that occur in Minnesota? Perpetrated by whom?
Dakota.
Okay, here's the thing. Genocide has a very specific legal definition. Does anybody know which conflict actually brings the word genocide into the lexicon? Say again?
World War I.
It's during World War I, but it's not World War I itself. It's the Armenian genocide brought about by the Turks. Okay, that's where the word is coined for the first time. So genocide does not exist as a concept here. It certainly existed in practice. Let's agree on that. But as a codified application of law, it does not exist. Now, here's the thing. I argue no. Genocide does not occur in Minnesota, but attempted ethnic cleansing absolutely does, and the Dakota perpetrate ethnic cleansing in the first part of the war, or attempt to. So, basically, ethnic cleansing is the attempt to remove from amongst yourselves any person or group of people that are different from you in identifiable ways, either by eradication, killing them, or moving them off of homeland. Okay? So, we could argue that, yeah, ethnic cleansing absolutely happens going both ways in 1862. I would argue against genocide. Was there a death march in 1862? I found that quote when I was doing my research in the Oral Histories archive. That whole march, that road, there must be bones laying all over.
No.
Nope. No, no, and no. This is one of those areas where you tend to appreciate the fact that some people are just really obsessed with details because the Army accounts for everybody and everything. Now, why do they do that? Because they care about people? No. Beans and bullets. You have to pay for everything. You have to pay for every ration you draw. You have to account for every wagon that you issue. You have to account for every freaking horseshoe that is thrown on the road from the lower agency down to, yeah. And so they account who starts, who leaves. Now here's the thing. There's no death march. There is no death march. Do Dakota die en route? Yes. And in at least 2 instances, some Dakota are killed because they are deliberately attacked by settlers en route, and the Army detachment that is responsible for protecting them fails to do so adequately. Now, where does one of those attacks occur? In New Ulm. There is a conspiracy theory or an argument that says that the column carrying the Dakota came through New Ulm rather than going around the town specifically to try to enrage the population here in New Ulm. Now, what unfortunately, through a coincidence, what was happening in New Ulm that same day? They had exhumed the dead that were buried in Main Street when they abandoned the town, and they were exhuming them to rebury them in the cemetery. And if you think people's emotions are not going to be running high at that time, so I believe it was an asinine blunder to take the shortest point between 2 routes, let's go through town because they've got the roads, as opposed to let's circle over on the high ground on the other side of the river. And it results in this. It's a criminal action. The attack on the defenseless men, older men, women, and children in the Dakota, that's a criminal act. The Army failed to protect them the way it should. But there's no death march. The reason why this really pisses me off is because I also grew up in the Philippines. Have we heard of the Bataan Death March? 3,000 American soldiers, 7,000 American POWs, 3,000 American, 7,000 Filipino POWs are murdered by the Japanese as they're marching up Rural Highway 1. That's a death march. This is not. Okay? Crimes are culture. That quote down there is really important. Okay? If a white man kills one of their people, the Indians kill him as an enemy, not as a criminal. If an Indian kills one of us, we kill him as a criminal, not an enemy. So, did the Dakota have a different concept of what was acceptable warfare than what white Americans did? Of course they did. Of course they did. It's less structured, it's less formalized, it's much more, there's not the kind of command and control structure that you have within a European-style army. And so the argument has come up that the Dakota should not have been put on trial because they were entitled to the legal status of prisoners of war. And several different people have said this, such as Carol Chomsky, and Professor Chomsky is brilliant. She was incredibly generous with her time and her insights when I was working on this. I disagree with her on this point, though, and again, it's because I come at this from a military perspective. The Commission tried the Dakota for the wrong crimes. Based on the historical legal views prevailing in 1862, the Dakota were a sovereign nation at war with the United States, and the men who fought the war were entitled to be treated as legitimate belligerents. Do you think I agree with that or disagree? I agree. The Dakota were sovereign. There's an easy way to prove it. Did they have treaties with the U.S. government? And only one branch of the U.S. government can ratify a treaty, and that's who? The Senate. And the Senate does not ratify treaties with non-sovereign nations. So clearly they were sovereign. But does that mean that just because you are a legitimate combatant, a legitimate belligerent, in a recognized conflict between 2 sovereign states, does that mean you are therefore exonerated for any criminal acts that you conduct in the process of the war? No, not at all. Soldiers are still liable to criminal prosecution if they commit war crimes. If they commit civilian crimes such as murder and rape. Murder and rape are not war crimes. Did you know that? They're not classified as war crimes. They're just criminal. So, different people have said different things about the prisoner of war debate. That the Dakota began to surrender believing they would be treated as prisoners of war. I disagree with everything she writes. Believing themselves to be prisoners of war, the Sioux pleaded guilty and were sentenced to hang. And then a voice from the Dakota themselves, Chief Big Eagle, I and others understood that General Sibley would treat with all of us who had only been soldiers and would surrender as prisoners of war. Okay. The one logical fallacy in all of this. Anywhere in Dakota history, in Native American traditions of warfare, is there any such concept as a prisoner of war? No. Do you take captives? Yes, quite often. But you take captives not with the expectation that you are going to repatriate them to their own side when the hostilities have ended and a treaty has been signed. No. You take captives, you keep them as slaves, or you adopt them into your tribe. There's no such thing as a formal status of prisoner of war. You can kill anybody, and you can keep some people. But it's not prisoner of war, and it's not legitimate belligerency the way that European American laws of war would understand it. The Glorious 38. This quote really pisses me off because all the guys were doing, all the people that were hanged, they defended what was rightfully theirs. That's all they were doing, and they were condemned. I will fight anybody who tries to convince me, as a soldier, who has shot at and been shot at, that you can ever justify acts of rape or infanticide as legitimate self-defense. Prove that to me. Cutnose bragged that he had killed so many children that his arm got tired from lifting the knife. He wasn't ashamed of that. Because, let's not forget, here again, this is where we get into the difference between traditional Dakota concepts of warfare and European American ones. For an American soldier, the glory, if there is any, comes in a stand-up fight face-to-face with an equal combatant. But amongst the Dakota, to kill an enemy, a member of your enemy's group, regardless of sex, regardless of age, regardless of armed or not armed, didn't matter because it's still part of the war. That's something that Americans then had a very hard time understanding. That there's no distinction in the Dakota way of looking at combat the way that we look at combat. Now, having said all that, real quick. Did the Dakota have the right, or should there have been an expectation that their manner of warfare, which was traditional and well established, should it have been recognized by the Americans when the war was over? Especially since, as you said, there's no codification of international laws of war at this point. I say yes, the Dakota War method of waging war should absolutely have been recognized, understood, and accepted right up until one moment. And that is, as soon as you have lost the war, and you now claim your enemy's laws of war to protect you, now that you're defeated, then you must accept that all of your enemy's laws of war apply to you retroactively. You don't get to say, I'm going to fight my way until I lose, and now you have to treat me the way that you said you would treat me. No. You don't get both. If you're going to be protected under the laws of war, then those laws of war apply to you throughout the entire conflict. Anybody disagree with me on that? Because not very many people make that argument. I think I made it in the book the first time that it actually entered print, and then it was like hugely controversial.
Well, I would just say, really, the people fighting would not be thinking of the laws of war. And in fact, the laws of war were unclear, weren't they? I mean,
very unclear, but there are moments where you get a picture of somebody's action or statement that they thought, they were thinking ahead. The day that the fighting breaks out, when the Indians attack the Lower Agency, White Spider, who is, if I remember correctly, is Little Crow's younger brother. Half-brother, thank you. He actually helps several women escape, kind of points them out, the mess of it all. One of the women tries to give him her wedding ring. It was the only thing of value she had on her. And White Spider said, no, I don't want your ring, but remember my face in case something happens. He wanted to be remembered for having done that rather than, the mayhem. So.
Isn't there in the literature too, where Little Crow is chastising all this rampaging and killing?
Yes.
You made me leader. I need to exert military command leadership.
Yes.
We got to take Ridgely, Fort, New Ulm, and head right up the valley.
And don't forget that.
Don't kill them and children.
Yeah, so he's saying that. Yeah, so saying
Little Crow knew something that most of the Dakota did not know. Little Crow had been across this country, had gone to D.C. and come back. He knew what the capacity for retributive violence was. And that statement that he made the night of the decision to go to war, kill white men all day long, and more white men with guns will come to kill you. And you'll be like, leaves on a tree. Exactly. So, when we look at these cases, there are some men who I would argue, from the standpoint of military law, are indefensibly guilty. Proven to have committed a crime, either the murder of a named person at a known place on a certain date, or the self-admitted rape of a named woman at a certain place. Can't prevaricate on those, okay? But, having said that, there are other men who I believe may not have been guilty at all, or were certainly less guilty and deserving of matters of mitigation that should not have been sentenced to death. So anytime one of the Dakota was convicted of participation in battle, that's not a war crime. That's not even a civilian crime. Soldiers are killed. This murder of Eliphat Richardson, who was riding as a courier, a scout, for the expeditionary force, even if they shot him in the back from ambush, so what? Ambush is an absolutely legitimate military tactic if you're engaged in an armed opponent.
If you change that from soldier to unarmed civilian, do you see the same?
No, totally different. Totally different. But you have to prove several things in there, right? Like, if the record showed a named victim at a known place on a certain date, not just they killed somebody and somebody saw it from a distance. There's too much ambiguity there. Red Anyanka, participation in leadership in battle and opposing the release of the captives. Not a single one of those is a crime. Skunkoska, White Dog. I have a lot of sympathy for White Dog. I believe nothing that I have ever found in the records or the archives tells me that he was guilty of anything that would stand as a crime under military law, a crime of war, or even a civilian offense. If he did, in fact, lure Captain Marsh into the ambush at the ferry crossing, that is a legitimate tactic of war. He did not carry out a false flag operation. He was not wearing the uniform of his enemy. If Captain Marsh allowed himself to be lulled into a false sense of security, whose fault is that? Right? Deception is an absolutely legitimate military tactic. Chaska, case number 3, felony murder. He was almost certainly mistaken for Chaska Dom. And there has been a lot of controversy, argument that perhaps this was a subtle, deliberate attempt by the members, by the Army to do away with him after, I just forgot the woman's name.
Wakefield.
Sorry?
Sarah Wakefield.
Thank you, Sarah Wakefield. After she advocated so impassionedly for him that people may have been offended at the idea of a white woman being perhaps somehow involved with a Native American man. There's never been any proof of that. Case number 332. This one may be the most heartbreaking. This young man, according to the closest we can get to the first person oral history accounts, he may have been what we today would call slow. And if you notice the similarity in the names, and I apologize, my pronunciation of Dakota names leaves a lot to be desired, okay? But the names are very similar, yes? The story goes that when his name was called, he was sitting near him and said, "Hey, they just called your name." Kid stands up, that's it. That's not been proven conclusively, but there's enough evidence to make it very, very plausible.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Did you find anything that led to suggest that that was a relative of Sibley?
Oh, that story.
Oh, was that the same boy?
Yes, yes. No, ma'am. And I have not done enough research to say definitively that absolutely not, but a couple of historians whom I have the utmost respect for and confidence in their scholarship have examined it, trying to prove it, and have not been able to say yes.
Thank you.
So if you're interested in some more really good reading on this, and you'll notice that there are names on here of historians I've said or scholars I say I disagree with some of their conclusions, right? Just because I disagree with them does not mean that their contributions should be overlooked. Some of their work is absolutely invaluable to understanding this history. But, as you've probably figured out, that book challenges a lot of the conceptions about the war that existed for 150 years. For those of you who are interested, those are my other 3 books. This one just was published, just released July, so about 5 weeks ago. This one is another legal study, and it deals with the largest murder trial in American history, which resulted in 19 executions and 91 prison sentences. And I was the lead historian on the case from 2020 until 2023, when we managed to get the U.S. Army to overturn the court-martial, and it's the largest act of clemency in American military history for that. And for those of you who may be interested, one copy of each. I will give a copy of the book to anybody who promises they will read it and write a scathing review. Love it, hate it, I don't care. But read it and post a review on Amazon, okay? Especially this one. My publisher is telling me the book's, it's already been nominated for a couple of awards, which is great, but which one?
Which one do you recommend?
This one has really done well in Europe. I don't know who, and by the way, the Dakota War book is in libraries it's in 978 libraries around the world right now. One of these days I'm going to take a trip and just visit the book wherever it's gone. I don't know who the heck is reading Minnesota history in Bulgaria, but God love them. Now, any questions I can answer to you? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, when it's always mentioned about the pardons Lincoln gave, like, what we're supposed to conclude about that decision. Like, was that amazing? Was that not really anything to be excited about? Like, I don't know what we're supposed to draw from hearing that.
I touch on that in the book because Lincoln is castigated, criticized, he's called a butcher, you know, he unjustly ordered the execution of 38 Native American men, etc. Right? Pope tried to kill 303 men. He did not because Lincoln, what was Lincoln's profession before he became a politician? A frontier lawyer. So not a lot of time wasted on fancy speeches, but a lot of time on common sense, practical application of law, especially when people's lives were on the line. And so Lincoln ordered his 2 lawyers who were reviewing the case for him to eliminate everybody who was only guilty of participation in battle, because that's not a crime, and that winnows it down. And he said then focus specifically on finding just those who can be shown to have been participated in massacre or rape. Those are crimes. Lincoln's decision to do anything other than order an immediate execution was fiercely controversial. He received so much criticism for being too lenient, for being an Indian lover, to use an ugly phrase. Lincoln was more devoted to the concept of the observance of the law. And so I think a lot of the criticism that's been directed at Lincoln for that final decision, I think a lot of it is unfair, me personally. I understand the other side, but I think it's unfair. Yes, sir.
I think in some of Whipple's literature it states that he was a catalyst for pushing for this, am I correct?
He was, very much so. Unfortunately, and I tried really hard to find it, there are no executive notes. Whipple has no notes from that day. Neither of them actually have an official record of what was done. They both mentioned it after the fact. I do believe that Whipple was correct, that Lincoln probably would have done a lot to try to change the Indian Bureau and the American approach to Native American rights on the frontiers had he not been assassinated in 1865. Yes, ma'am.
Had Sibley not started the trials and Hope not finished them? How do you, and was there anything else for Lincoln to review the assassinations?
So,
Or excuse me.
let me answer your question by asking a question first. From just the way I've talked about this, do you think that I am pro-Sibley or anti-Sibley? Do you think I'm critical of Sibley, or do you think I
don't think you're either. I have a feel, after reading and doing a little research on you, I thought you were anti.
Whoa, what? Historians are not supposed to be researched ourselves. There's a line that's in the book. I set out to study this case, believing that Sibley had been unfairly criticized. And I was basically kind of setting out to try to rehabilitate his memory, his legacy. I came to the conclusion that Sibley has not yet, or had not until I wrote the book, had not been criticized enough for certain things, okay? Now here's the thing. Sibley was fiercely criticized for forming the military commission here in Minnesota in 1862. Why? Because people thought it was a travesty of justice? No, they thought, why are you wasting time putting Indians on trial? Kill them as you find them. 600 settlers are dead. The Army had an established protocol for dealing with Indian uprisings of this sort. You know what it was? Punitive massacre. The Army had done that 7 times in the previous 25 years in different parts of the American frontier. Indian uprising, a few white people are killed, we'll go in and wipe out that village or just kill X number of them that we find. No trial process, no legal proceedings, just eye for an eye, tit for tat. So in that sense, Sibley really imperiled his personal reputation by feeling that trials were a necessity, that they were merited. So I applaud him for that. I criticize him for then letting himself be steamrolled by John Pope.
Maybe that's why he saved so many of the Dakota.
Do you know anything about Sibley's evolving thoughts on the Dakota? Because if he was a fur trade guy, like, he would have interacted with them so much.
If you read Sibley's personal writings
Yeah.
from the 1850s, no, go back to the 1840s, right? Before he's even in Minnesota politics, before he becomes the territorial governor. Sibley is staunchly, and mind you, there's a certain amount of patronizing, 19th century, the noble savage ideal in his language. These people were just great until we arrived and started corrupting. People are people. There's a corrupting element in the European expansion across the West, no question about that, but we don't have to teach bad people how to be bad. But Sibley is a staunch supporter of, defender of, advocate for the Dakota. The first things he writes when the news of what's happening out here in the southern counties happens, you see an instantaneous change. I get the impression he was horrified. He was shocked. And he almost, I think he felt a sense of personal betrayal, that he had stood up for these people and all of a sudden, and so he reacted extremely personally, not professionally. I think that's where I come at.
Okay.
Anybody else?